You're listening to From the Chair, and I'm your host, Mike Hamilton. Join us each episode as we talk to athletic directors from across America. We're going to talk about topics like leadership, career development, issues of the day, and I can promise you we're going to have some fun along the way too. So sit back, listen in, and let's dive in. Let's go. All right, welcome into today's episode. Really a treat today to visit with the president and CEO of Lead One, Tom McMillen. Tom, thanks for joining me.
Great to be with you, Mike, and happy holidays.
Same to you. Same to you. You know, I was as I was sort of going through your life story and the things that you've been involved in, I thought of the Dos Equis commercial, the most interesting man in the world. You know, I think we could certainly sit down sometime, have a Diet Coke or some other kind of drink, and talk for a long, long time, because I'm truly intrigued by your story, and I do want to touch on some of your personal story today, if I could. And then I want to, obviously, the last half of our interview, obviously want to focus on the work of Lead One and all that's going on in college athletics today. You know, for Tom, for those who, a lot of us know your story, but for those who don't, thinking back to your time and even in high school, being on the cover of Sports Illustrated and being the top-ranked basketball player in America and making the decision to go play for Lefty at Maryland and having quite a career there at Maryland. Let's start with that if we could. I found it interesting that at the time, you know, I grew up in the ACC, so let me say that. And so have loved basketball for many, many years. The old ACC, when there were only like 7 schools, right? And I know Maryland is in the Big Ten now, but you, as I understand it, you chose to go to play for Lefty at a time where he had not been at Maryland very long, and you were recruited by Dean Smith, and you were recruited by John Wooden and a number of the Ivies. What drew you to Maryland originally?
Well, it's a long story, Mike, but, you know, I initially had committed to Dean Smith in North Carolina verbally. You know, I loved Coach Smith. I loved Carolina and all that. But what happened is I went over to Europe on a tour with some of the Carolina players and others. It was an Olympic tour. And my dad got sick, and I came back, and, you know, my dad was really caught up in watching me play. And I realized that, you know, he didn't have long to live, and that he would want to see me play. And so I started reconsidering. He wanted me to really go to Maryland. He liked Lefty a lot. You know, I think it was partially because he wanted to come see me play. We were about 4.5-hour drive from there. And that's what happened. I ended up going to Maryland. And my father saw so many of my games, and he passed away my senior year. So the other thing that happened to me was, it was kind of interesting. That cover of Sports Illustrated led to me being recruited by President Nixon to be the youngest member of the President's Council on Physical Fitness and Sports. So I was appointed to a presidential commission when I was in high school. I think I'm still the youngest presidential appointee ever. And so the idea of being in Washington really, it sounded even more interesting now that I was going to be on a presidential commission. So there were a lot of factors, but you know, Maryland turned out to be a very good decision. So.
Yeah, a lot of foreshadowing right there with the Nixon appointment, and certainly you graduated from Maryland, as you still hold the career scoring average for Maryland basketball, and you were valedictorian. I believe you had a degree in chemistry, if I'm not mistaken, and you know, went on to Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. And during that time, and Tom, I can't remember the exact sequencing. You also went to the '72 Olympics, and this is the 50th year of that Olympic time in Munich. And I think that there are two things I wanted to just, you know, certainly there was the very tragic circumstance of the terrorists being involved there in the village and actually killing some Israeli team members. And then, you know, just very shortly thereafter, you guys as the U.S. Olympic team had a very unfortunate set of circumstances with the Russian team where the game was actually stolen from you, maybe even just a few days later. And at the time, you're probably, 20 years old, maybe 21 years old, and you had these dual times of, I would call it, tragic circumstances. Just a reflection on that, and maybe how you process that over the years.
Well, you were right. That event, that Munich terrorist event, was just so surreal to think that terrorism would intrude on this Olympic Village. First of all, the word terrorism wasn't even well known back then. There weren't a lot of incidents of it. If you lived in maybe Northern Ireland, you understood it. But, for most people, that was a foreign concept. And here, these these Arab terrorists stormed the village. And we got up that morning, you could go over there and see them standing on the balcony. And yet we had to go practice and get ready for the game. Our game was 5 days later. But the way that ended with the Israeli athletes being murdered, it was just disheartening, and it's so disruptive to the idea that you had to go forward and play for the World Championship, which we had to do 5 days later at midnight. We played a game at midnight just to reach the television audience back in the United States. And we were a young team playing against really a pro-Russian team. They were really actually pros. And we came from behind and we won the game. And they just kept resetting the clock until finally the Soviets prevailed. And as you know, we refused to accept the silver medals, still have not accepted them. And it's probably the most controversial game in Olympic history.
Wow. I would commend those who like to read Dick Ebersol's recent biography. Talks a little bit about this from behind the scenes. I think what's called From Saturday Night to Sunday Night. And he was there, obviously, helping to broadcast the games and determine what was going to be on air and what was not going to be on air during that time.
And they kept on the air. Jim McKay just went round the clock during that whole thing, and it was a really, Howard Cosell was the one that ended up making our case in front of the appeal committee. It was an incredibly surreal experience that you go over there as a young athlete thinking the Olympics are the highest ideal. And then of course you have a terrorism event and then our basketball game and many other controversies, and you kind of walk away sobered by it all.
So shortly thereafter, you were honored with and you achieved this, but you were honored with the opportunity to become a Rhodes Scholar and study at Oxford, and that's a very that's a significant thing in anyone's life, and I'm sure it was in yours. For those who many of us can't even conceptualize what that was like. I really would love your perspective on playing basketball in America. You graduated as valedictorian of your class. You've got a degree in chemistry. You've been in the Olympics. And you're now you're at Oxford. When you went to there, what was your intention in terms of what you wanted to garner from an educational perspective? And then can you maybe share a story of how that was fulfilled?
Well, we have to put it in today's light because no one would ever do that. I walked away from a first round NBA selection. I was drafted by the Buffalo Braves. The owner was from my hometown, and the Virginia Squires in the ABA, and I walked away from that. And I went over to Italy. I went over to Oxford, but I commuted to Italy and other places around Europe and played basketball. And so I played as a pro in Europe while I was going to school at Oxford. And what happened was Oxford is a 2-year program, and it was the most important accomplishment of my college life. People find that sort of surprising that I would mention that as opposed to sports accomplishments, but I was the first Rhodes Scholar ever from the University of Maryland, and that was just a high honor for me. And when I went over there, as I said, I was playing basketball, and I played 50 some games in Europe and Italy, and my attorney came over and said, the ABA and NBA emerging, you're going to have to give up your second year of the Rhodes and come back, otherwise it's going to cost you a lot of money. And I said, I don't want to do that because I don't want to give up my Rhodes Scholarship. And then I went to the Oxford officials and I said, will you let me go back in the summers and finish up in 3 summer terms? And they said no. And until I found out that Cecil Rhodes, the founder of the Rhodes Scholarship, did that. In fact, I went back to them and said, look, the founder did that. You've got to give me that same opportunity. And that's what happened. I ended up getting permission. And for 3 straight summers after the NBA, I went over there and finished my Rhodes Scholarship degree. So, That was just a wonderful experience.
So following that, you played 11 years in the NBA with multiple franchises. And, your basketball career is certainly well noted. And to play in the NBA for 11 years after having had a very successful career in the ACC, no one can question your skill there. And I found it. The other thing that I found interesting, Tom, you then, while you were still in the NBA, made a choice to run for Congress. And I don't know if it's happened since, but I know at the time you were the first ever professional athlete to run for Congress while also playing a professional sport.
Right.
And I'm interested in, so you had that presidential appointment from Nixon, right? And you've been a Rhodes Scholar, all those sorts of things. You've lived in the DC area, but it seems like a really interesting pivot to decide to run for Congress while playing in the NBA. What drove that decision?
Well, first of all, I had the opportunity to play with Bill Bradley on the Knicks for 1 year. So here we have two Rhodes Scholars. He ends up leaving the Knicks, sitting out about a year and running for the Senate in New Jersey, and he won. And so Bill and I were close, and we kept in touch. And what happened was I had bought a house in Maryland, and where I went to school, and I went and spent my summers there and kind of tried to be active politically. But I was playing for the Atlanta Hawks. And I loved playing for Ted Turner in Atlanta. So one day I went to Ted. I said, Ted, I love playing for you. I've been here 6 years, but I really would love for you to trade me to Washington so I could run for Congress. Not realizing he would ever do that, but I had a good relationship with him, and so he did. He traded me to Washington, literally, so I could run for Congress. So I ended up playing 3 years up in Washington. But before the start of my last year, my third year, I announced for Congress. I was going to run against an incumbent. She then ended up retiring. So the whole season, I'm campaigning while I'm playing basketball. And my season was over in May. My primary was in May. I won. And so in November, I barely won. But I think I was the closest race in the House of Representatives, 424 votes. But, I pulled it off, which is no easy feat. I don't think it'll ever be done again because it's not an easy thing to do. And I don't think anybody will try it.
Yeah. You and I were talking offline. You were involved in you were involved in multiple different ways, staying in touch with college athletics and athletics in general, but in particular, a couple of different things that you were engaged with at the time. One was, disclosure, schools, having to disclose, needing to disclose graduation rates and that sort of thing. And that became an important part of, I believe, of the college experience. And then also an antitrust bill. So would you mind sharing with the audience those two things?
Well, the Student Right to Know bill was a graduation disclosure bill, and Bill Bradley and I and another congressman worked on that. We passed it. At the time, the NCAA was opposed to it, but it's just such a common sense disclosure bill that today it's hard to believe college sports without APR, without all those graduation rates. So it shows you that Congress can sometimes do good things in pushing the collegiate sports enterprise. The other bill was an antitrust bill. I thought that this fragmentation of television contracts, it was just starting because the Supreme Court decision had just occurred in '84, and my bill was '91. I thought that was going to lead to lots of disruption, and I thought there should be a reconsolidation of television rights under the NCAA with antitrust protection. In other words, but they would have to do certain things. They'd have to do more for student athletes, and more in general, gender equity, a whole bunch of things. But it was an attempt to try to protect the NCAA, and no one has ever done that. I wouldn't be surprised if it comes back in a few years because the NCAA finds itself needing antitrust protection on numerous fronts. The irony of all that is that here you have, here when I was in Congress, I put that bill in and I said, this is a bill that people will look at 30 years from now. I called it sort of one of those time capsule bills that you put in and people look at it 30 years later. And when I introduced the bill, that's exactly what I said. It was that maybe this is early now, but people will look back at it as a concept years from now.
So we are looking back at that and more now, particularly all of us, but in your role as president and CEO of Lead One, I know you are. And, for historical perspective, obviously Lead One was evolved out of the D1A Athletic Directors Association, an organization that was originally founded to be an advocate for the FBS and the schools and the ADs that are in the FBS. And it had a highly educational focus, which I know you still retain today. It had an advocacy role, which you obviously are very much engaged with. And then when Dutch retired and changed the name to Lead One, and you were hired in your role, one of the focuses, as I understand it, was, hey, we believe that this next phase of college athletics is probably going to involve some congressional activity at some point or in time. And it was just totally logical for you to be chosen in that role. I'm curious to hear from you, the job that you took and then the job that you're in today. You, in the middle of that, you obviously had to help the organization navigate through a pandemic. You've had the notion of the NIL, the transfer portal, FBS governance, the transformation committee. You've got another league trying to spin up to into the Division One now. A lot of activity happening. How has your role evolved over these last 6 or 7 years as it relates to that particular line of work?
So when Jack Swarbrick, the Notre Dame athletic director, took over as chairman, he wanted to refocus the organization more on policy, particularly policy within the NCAA, because he felt that if you could pull ADs together across conferences, that they would have, a force, they would have a voice. And that's exactly what we've done over the last few years, whether it's infractions or federated sports or academic misconduct or transfers or NIL. We've created work groups of ADs and staff, and we've put policy initiatives forward. Many of them have been adopted by the NCAA. In the infractions area, we came forward with 11 recommendations. 8 of them were adopted by the NCAA. So the real thinking about Lead One was that everybody works within their conferences, but rarely do they work between the conferences, and that you needed some cross-conference collaboration if you're really going to get things done. That's even become more difficult now with Alston, because you can't collude on anything to do with student-athlete benefits, but it's so important that athletic directors from different conferences get together and talk about issues. And that's what we've done. The most recent is this whole FBS football governance issue, where a number of ADs, including Gene Smith from Ohio State, said, let's move it out of the NCAA, how we govern football. And we got together, we've talked about it, we've had work groups. At the end of the day, they came to the conclusion, well, maybe we need to figure out how to fix it within the NCAA. And that was the essence of our proposal that we released, that we submitted to the NCAA a few days ago. But Lead One is really a thought leader more than anything else. We provide, as you said, webinars and education on various issues, but our primary goal is to try to advance the interests of the ADs, as you suggested.
So, Tom, this is more curiosity than anything else. You played in the NBA. We follow the NFL, MLB, et cetera. And in those sports associations, there's some commonality of thought. There's, and I know the antitrust and all that sort of plays into this. So let me say this. But one of the things that's interesting in college athletics is just the different kinds of schools, the different kinds of leagues, the geography, different state laws, different budgets, but yet trying to operate under one umbrella. So, how do you put all these, you're NCAA president for a day. I mean, maybe you'll be NCAA president for a long time, right? But you're NCAA president for a day here. What do you think the notion is that we have to be thinking about to draw better solutions from where we've been in the past? I just feel like, everybody's typically in the way that we're structured, because the NCAA is the schools, we are all mostly concerned about our own self-interest, right? How do we navigate through that? You're in a key role as it relates to that narrative.
Well, first of all, you have to recognize, as you suggested, that there are tremendous differences. There are schools with a few million in revenue and schools with 200 million in revenue. And I think they have to be managed and segregated according to their means in some respects. I mean, it's hard to make the same rules for a $200 million school as a small school, and so I just think you need to, as they use the word, federate more. I think that's a trend that we're going to see happening more and more, and that's just not by school, but it's going to be by sport. If you're a basketball program in a $200 million program, you're a lot different than a basketball program in a $5 million school. And so I think that you have to recognize this is not the NFL where there is more homogeneity amongst the teams, but the NFL goes to great extent to make sure that the weakest team remains strong, and they do lots of different things, including rev sharing, to ensure that the league has balance. And that's a challenge in college sports because it's a lot more Darwinian. It's a dog eat dog, world, and I think that has to be addressed at some point in time. Where Congress fits into this, I think it's remains to be seen. They may get a deal done here during the lame duck session. It'll be a simple deal just to get it done. But if they don't get a deal done in the lame duck session, I think we're looking at something that could drag on for some period of time because there's so many other issues that members of Congress have to deal with. I think the sleeper issue out there in college sports, if I had to pick one, I know Alston and paying players and all that are very big issues, and I think that will evolve over time. But I think the big issue that could really be existential for college sports is the sports betting issue. Listen, sports betting is pervasive around the globe. $200 billion of it, $5 billion in the United States. So it's here and you have to accept that. But the difference in America is that sports betting is occurring on college campuses. That doesn't occur anywhere else in the world. And so if it blows up, because you have scandals in Europe, you have scandals in Pakistan, you have scandals in India, you have scandals, sports betting scandals all throughout the world. And so it's inevitable you'll have sports betting scandals in the United States. How will the United States react if our universities are enmeshed in those scandals? That's a question that I think about because it could have profound implications for college sports. And I could go on and on about it, but that's the simple point. And it's not like it's not happening. I was talking to the CEO of U.S. Integrity in Vegas, and he was telling me that of all the football games on weekends, there's 8% of them have betting abnormalities. In other words, irregularities. That's probably 5 games that they have to go back in and do a super watchdog on to see if there was anything occurring in those games. But the very fact that you have those kinds of abnormalities going on, and you couple that with NIL, the locker room where one player may be making $1 million from NIL and another player, benches away, maybe making nothing, and it's a very complicated situation and really with high risk.
Yeah. I had a conversation with some athletic staff members from a Power 5 conference recently, and I was asking them, and by the way, this was in a state where gambling is not yet legalized, and I was asking them if they had any notion what the betting might have been on their football and basketball programs last year and legalized gambling, right? Even though it wasn't in their state. And one person said 7 million, another person said 9, another said 12. And then I shared with them again through our partnership with U.S. Integrity at Learfield, we knew that school had $174 million bet on their football and basketball programs last year in a state where legally bet on their program, in a state where gambling is not legal in that particular state. So it shows the dollars at play. And whenever you're talking about those kinds of dollars, the framework and understanding of what all that looks like is going to be really critical moving forward. Clearly.
Yeah, and I'm not putting my head in the sand. This exists. It's going to exist, but it is a very complicated existence in America because of our universities. When I was at Oxford, they would have they had the big rowing, the crew race down on the Thames River in London, and that was between Oxford and Cambridge, and there was lots of betting on that. That wasn't on campus. That was the only sports event on a campus I'm aware of, that's not even on a campus. That was in London. But the United States is a complicated situation, and I think the NCAA should be working. We need national legislation. We need national NIL legislation. We also need national sports betting legislation.
Yeah.
Because we need to make sure that the safeguards in place, because we cannot have our universities blow up. That would be really critical for our nation.
Yeah. So I want to ask you about two other issues relative to your opinion on significant things in the marketplace. First of all, I don't know where the numbers landed, but I know just a few days ago, it was noted that there were well over 1,000 student athletes in the transfer portal in college football. And as you know, some of those play up, some of those play down, some of those end up with no opportunity of another place to go. And clearly we need to be thinking about, by the way, I'm a proponent of student athletes being able to find a place to go to college and fulfill all their dreams. So let me say that out of the chute. But I'm just worried about what does all this mean with just the complete free flow, right? And I know one of the arguments over time has been, well, a coach can do that. But a coach just has some parameters in terms of penalty of separation, and they have to do it in the year, et cetera, et cetera. I'm interested in your perspective on where we are in this discussion around the transfer portal, and would love to hear your thoughts.
The transfer portal obviously is a consequence of, everything that we see happening in student athletes is because coaches have been able to move around and switch teams and do that pretty much regularity. What I think is that there's got to be ways to incent kids not to leave the campus, because what we see happening is kids are perfectly happy on the campuses now, and they're leaving. Why are they leaving? They're leaving because on the other side there's an inducement, there's more money, someone is offering them something on the other side, and agents are very much involved in this. I heard the other day agents are making 20% to get kids to transfer, and I don't know if that's a healthy situation where kids are just transferring for the bigger dollars. We need to be creative about designing a system, and that may involve television rights eventually, where we are giving a kid an incentive to stay with a given school, not just get up and leave. Now, the perverse side of that, some coaches are trying to get rid of kids and push them into the transfer portal. And I don't necessarily think that's good either, but it's, as I said, when you add all this up, this transfers, the inducements, NIL, kind of pale, it's something that I don't know whether college sports is going to be able to get back into the bottle. That's one of the concerns I have, is that this is going to become so regularized. And if they're waiting for Congress, I'm hopeful that Congress will get something done. But if they don't get it done shortly, it won't get done anytime soon. And there's going to be a lot of excesses in the marketplace. I hear so many stories from ADs and from coaches and so forth that I don't think it's even percolated in the media a lot. I don't read a lot about this, and I do think that's one of the, and part of it is because a lot of these deals are under the table. You don't know what they are, and yet I think somewhere down the road a lot of this is going to get out, and I think that may be the call to action.
I think, first of all, I think you're right. I think it's interesting what the potential impact on football. As you know, if you're trying to transition a basketball program with one or two great players, you can turn your course of your basketball success in many ways. In football, it's always been really hard to I always said it was like trying to turn around an aircraft carrier and maybe in the middle of the Potomac River, for your sake, since you're there. I used to say the Tennessee River. It's very difficult, but now you can actually perhaps fix a roster with a number of players coming in and maybe changing the outlook very quickly. Tom, so I've been trying to noodle on this, right? And one of the things I'm kind of thinking, the end of the day, between the NIL and portal and all these sorts of things, do, for lack of a better way to reference it, let's call it the elite brands, the most historically successful brands, the ones with the most dollars. Do you not think at the end of the day that probably settles right back into this sort of um, same sort of framework that it's always been historically, the the strongest survive, so to speak? Or do you think this truly gives us an opportunity for maybe some schools who haven't been at the forefront of competitively to maybe achieve something different?
I think the former is true. I think it'll settle back to
Yeah.
the incumbents with resources will continue to prevail. I mean that's bottom line. This is going to be resource driven, and I think those schools with resources will succeed. Look at University of Southern California this year. I mean, they almost made it. They could have been national champion, and they did it remarkably through the portal. And so here's the irony of that, and you know this better than anybody, is that it's putting enormous pressure on coaches. I mean, if you don't win within the first year, then that's a whole new calculus. In the past, it always took you a few years to recruit your way to success. Now, you can do it overnight. And so I think the churn in coaches' salaries are going to be, coaches and salaries are going to be even greater velocity. I think that also puts pressure on the system to pay players, because look at how many coaches that we're doing buyouts for, and they call it dead money. And I think that's only growing, and more guaranteed contracts and all that. And the optics of that on Capitol Hill are, if you can pay a coach $30 million to go sit on the beach, you can certainly pay some young athletes. And that's one of the problems, that the story is not real clean from the standpoint of, why shouldn't players have the same rights as coaches? And it reminds me back when I was in a hearing 30 years ago on college sports in Congress. We just passed the first $1 million football coach salary. And I said, at the time, well, we should be expecting $1 million player soon enough. And it literally took 30 years for that to happen. But I think it's going to happen more quickly now. And fundamentally, you got to figure out whether is the answer to college sports to look exactly like the NFL and the NBA, because that's where we're heading. And that's the core question, and we're going to have to address that. And you add sports betting to that and everything else, and this great experiment of college sports, which is one of the best human development machines in our country, but it's going to get complicated, because if you realize how important higher ed is into this country, and the fact that the Chinese are really competing with us at all levels, and our universities are really our fortress, and you understand that this gets very, very complicated. And from a national standpoint, if we do have things blow up and there's scandals, and let's say there could very well be NIL scandals. There could be kids that are promised things, don't get it, deals go wrong. Also, they could be involved in sports betting. All those things create complexities for the enterprise. And, it's going to be really challenging. The job of the NCAA president is not going to be an easy one.
Yeah. Well, I do think these next 12 to 24 months will be interesting relative to the continued involvement of different state legislatures in the NIL process, the different methodologies of how colleges and universities are approaching it. Certainly the engagement with collectives and those that will be here for a while and those that will quickly fade into the background. I've talked to a number of folks who have said the collectives that are present on their campus, they certainly rounded up dollars, so to speak, in the first year, but they don't really know where those dollars, as at least as it's measured against the first year, are going to come in years 2 and 3. So a lot of topics, and that you and I could go on and maybe have a part 2 conversation on this, right? But I want to be sensitive to your time, and I want to close on something. I want to close on an upbeat, right? And not that there's been plenty that we've talked about that's upbeat. But for you in particular, someone who took full advantage of the college experience, both athletically and certainly academically. And you parlayed that into many other wonderful opportunities, both professionally as an athlete, but also just your furthering your academic career, and you serve in Congress, and so much that came for you in particular out of that. Maybe your one takeaway, reflective now on what college athletics meant to you, and your hope for those who now are in those same spots at the universities around our country.
It's a different world. I never thought that sports was going to be the end all for me. That in my generation, it couldn't be the end all. We didn't make enough money for it to be the end all for our career. So I knew I had to have that insurance policy in education. And I really believed in that scholar athlete duality. I thought that was the essence of what college sports was all about. Today, kids are in a position where, if they're a first round draft pick in the NBA, in their career, they can make $500 million. It's a whole different, and the problem is very few get to do that. But it's that dream, which really, we all grew up with kids. I can remember kids on our team who thought they were going to be in the NBA, and they shortchanged their academics and their career, and then they ended up stumbling in life. I think it's even more difficult now. These kids, the sirens call is so great that it's hard to keep a balance. It really is. But yet, on the other hand, I look at these kids, and our schools do such a great job of giving them an education and holding their hand and working with them and tutoring them and giving them the breaks, that it's a remarkable system. It's just that it's going to have some challenges in the years to come, and hopefully we don't lose sight of that important precept that separates college sports from the pros, which is that kids are there to get an education and to play sports. And if we keep that balance, I think it can continue to be successful.
Awesome. Well, Tom, this has been a great conversation, as I expected it would be. And as I said, we could go on and on. I know that for a fact, based upon our initial conversation here. We have, in our work at Learfield, really appreciated our time to be able to partner with you along the way, and maybe be helpful where we've been able to be helpful. We appreciate very much what you're doing to represent the great universities around this country in your role at Lead One. Certainly want to continue to wish you success, and we look forward to continuing to figure out ways that we can lean in and be helpful with you. So thank you for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mike. And again, happy holidays to you. Look forward. I'll see you on the trail, I'm sure, somewhere.
You will definitely do that. All right, folks, you've been listening
Sounds
from
good.
the chair. It's my great pleasure today to bring to you Tom McMillen, who's president and CEO of Lead One. I hope you'll listen into this and all of our podcasts each week. We release on Wednesdays on all the audio platforms, and certainly here on YouTube as well for those of you who want to see it in a video format. I hope you've had a great holiday season, and we'll talk to you next time. Have a good day.